The human mind is desperate to ignore the deep darkness that shouldn't exist in our quiet, normal world until it is far too late. I still wake up in the dead of night, suddenly hearing my wife screaming, realizing my stubbornness almost dragged her into the grave. I never believed in the haunted stories, right up until a freezing snowstorm hit 1976 at an isolated lodge off Route 66. My heavy engineering job kept me on the lonely road constantly, driving for days through the deep, misty pine forest of the Pacific Northwest. The company always booked me a specific, cheap room at the crumbling Blackwood Pines Guesthouse, a massive wooden structure rotting away in the rain. I stayed in room 214, so often it felt like a weird second home, despite the eerie chill that always hung in the air. The elderly lodge manager, a grumpy guy named Hank, always gave me the exact same bizarre, panicked warning every single time I checked in. He pleaded with me to never leave the heavy wooden window open after 5 p.m., no matter how terribly hot the dusty room got. If you pushed those old creaking glass panes open, you found yourself staring directly into a massive, forgotten, overgrown graveyard right outside the wall. Being a man of harsh logic and strict science, that grim view never bothered me, and I just laughed off the old man's fears. I had spent countless lonely nights in that exact bed, hearing the bitter wind outside, but feeling absolutely nothing completely out of the ordinary. Sometimes the heavy silence of the room would play terrifying tricks on my tired ears, making me think someone was faintly whispering my name. I'd sit up in the pitch-black darkness, heart pounding, turning on the small bedside lamp, only to find the dusty room completely empty. I always blamed the old pipes and the freezing drafts, firmly convincing my tired brain that ghosts simply did not exist in our reality. But everything horrifyingly changed on a bitter Friday the 13th, when I finally decided to bring my beautiful wife Sarah and our young son. The moment we stepped into the dim lobby, the elderly manager stared at my beautiful wife with an absolute look of total, sickening dread. He nervously handed over the cold brass keys, his shaking hands violently trembling as he leaned across the polished wooden front reception desk.
I am begging you folks, please, do not leave that window open tonight, and whatever you do, never stand there with your hair down.
I just chuckled loudly, grabbing the heavy keys, completely brushing off his panicked warnings as just another creepy local legend to scare dumb tourists. I hauled our heavy leather bags up the creaking wooden stairs, totally ignoring the freezing drop in temperature walking down the extremely dark hallway. I had to immediately leave for a quick site inspection downtown, leaving Sarah and my little boy totally alone in that bitterly cold room. Sarah desperately wanted to relax after the brutal drive, entirely unaware of the sick, twisted, ancient history silently waiting just outside the thick glass. After putting our exhausted son to sleep, she unclipped her long, wet brown hair, casually walking over to that violently forbidden window for air. She pushed the heavy wooden frame and the creaking door opened, instantly exposing the vast, endless sea of rotting stone tombstones right directly below. A thick, unnatural fog was rolling heavily through the cemetery, wrapping around ancient crosses like cold, pale, grasping, completely dead fingers in the mist. Absolute terrified panic seized her chest as she immediately slammed the heavy glass shut, firmly locking the thick latch, violently trembling on the bed. She sat in the complete silence of the dreadful room, her heart pounding wildly as she clutched our sleeping boy tight against her chest. I finally returned a few hours later, aggressively stepping inside to find my wife pale as a ghost, aggressively demanding that we immediately leave.
There is a terrifying graveyard right outside that glass Marcus, and I swear something evil in the dark shadows was actually watching my heavy breathing.
I sat her down, firmly holding her violently shaking hands, patiently explaining I had slept in this exact room dozens of times without one issue. I foolishly convinced her it was just her tired mind playing tricks, totally unaware she had accidentally broken the manager's only sacred, truly terrifying rule. She kept her deep, terrible secret, never once telling me she had stood directly in front of that open glass with her hair totally unbound. As the dark, heavy midnight finally settled in, an unnatural, freezing cold rapidly swept through the bedroom, chilling my bones beneath heavy wool blankets. By exactly 11 p.m., a violent storm began raging wildly outside, freezing rain violently lashing against the old glass while the ancient wooden building groaned. I was suddenly jolted completely awake from a deep sleep by a sickening, wet thud that violently shook the wooden floorboards right beside me. I rolled over in the completely pitch-black room, desperately reaching for my terrified wife in the cold bed, but my hand grabbed empty sheets. A massive, blinding crash of bright lightning violently illuminated the terrifying room, instantly revealing a living, breathing nightmare I will absolutely never forget today. Sarah was physically hovering a few terrified inches off the floor, violently clutching the edge of the heavy oak table with bleeding, tearing fingernails. Her long brown hair was pointing straight toward the rattling window, pulled tightly, as if an invisible dead fist was viciously dragging her completely backward. Paralyzed by terrifying panic, her jaw stretched wide in a silent scream as the invisible force violently dragged her toward the heavily locked window. I lunged across the freezing room, wrapping arms tightly around her waist, desperately trying to pull my terrified wife away from the dark force. The raw brute strength of whatever held her hair was entirely unnatural, aggressively pulling us both across the rough floorboards toward the cursed graveyard outside. I started shouting at the top of my lungs, loudly begging anyone to hear my desperate, frantic crying in the extremely cold darkness. Heavy boots came running down the dark hallway, followed by the loud crash of the wooden door, aggressively kicked completely off its old rusty hinges. 3 massive guests quickly rushed inside with the old manager, terrified eyes going wide watching my wife, physically levitating directly toward the cold window glass.
Grab her legs and drag her to the bed right now, before the terrifying darkness outside rips her straight through the completely smashed glass frame.
It took 5 grown men to drag her thrashing body back to the mattress, aggressively pinning her violently shaking arms firmly against the heavy wood. Even fully pinned down, an absolute demonic strength possessed her physical body, violently shaking the bed frame while she aggressively thrashed against our desperate hands.
It violently wants to kill me, Marcus. The cold, dead things outside are dragging me into the rotting earth. Please don't let me go.
I sat beside her sobbing wildly, placing both my shaking hands firmly on her burning forehead, desperately chanting every religious prayer I completely knew. For 3 horrific hours, I held her tightly down while she desperately fought against invisible shadows, her bloodshot eyes staring directly into terrifying blackness. The terrified guests quickly backed out of the destroyed room, completely refusing to stand near that haunted window during the violently dark night storm. The old manager nervously stayed behind, his pale face dripping with cold sweat, watching my wife aggressively wrestle against those completely invisible, terrifying demons. Her wrists were severely bruised and actively bleeding from how intensely she thrashed against our grip, loudly screaming the hungry dead wanted her soul. Every single time the freezing wind rattled the broken window glass, her exhausted body violently spasmed, as if suddenly struck by cruel dark lightning. I refused to stop loudly chanting my religious prayers, completely drowning out the howling wind and her extremely agonizing, desperately terrified crying night screams. Finally, around 6 a.m., the heavy black storm clouds suddenly broke, allowing a single bright ray of warm morning sunshine to pierce the room. The exact moment that bright warm light deeply touched her heavily bruised face, her entirely exhausted physical body instantly went completely cold and limp. The sickening demonic energy completely vanished instantly, leaving her physically drained, entirely exhausted, and staring completely blankly at the heavily scratched wooden room floorboards. We frantically packed our heavy leather bags in absolute silence, intensely sprinting to our waiting car, never once looking at the horrific decaying walls. The old hotel manager silently stood on the dying front porch, his pale face solemnly confirming everything he had desperately tried warning us today. You can completely tell yourself extreme fear creates wild hallucinations, but 5 grown men physically felt that utterly impossible dark strength inside her bones. That entirely haunted dark lodge still stands rotting away off the lonely highway today, completely abandoned to the incredibly harsh wild forest natural elements. It is totally surrounded by deeply thick, overgrown dead weeds, and a massively creeping, dreadful silence that actively suffocates all surrounding cold forest air. Local folks strictly refuse to ever go anywhere near the heavily decaying property after dark, deeply terrified of those incredibly cursed, surrounding dark woods. They absolutely know exactly what ancient, extremely terrifying, hungry, dark evil still violently lurks completely behind that specific, deeply broken, shattered front window glass. Since that deeply horrific night, I have absolutely never once let my beautiful wife Sarah safely sleep with her long hair totally flowing down. I am still completely terrified that those invisible, violent, rotting dead hands might eventually slowly return one silent evening to finish their horrible job. Some incredibly dark historical secrets are much better left completely deeply buried safely underneath the incredibly thick decaying dark forest dirt absolutely forever today. This is especially completely deeply true for the extremely horrifying demonic ones that actively try dragging me kicking and absolutely loudly screaming violently today. I genuinely hope that absolute nightmare never heavily visits your completely innocent, peaceful family during the deeply silent, cold, absolutely pitch black midnight hours. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe, hit like, share it with someone who needs to hear this. I'll see you soon.